And good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I do hope you had an absolutely fantastic weekend. It's really summertime here in Ardmore, Oklahoma. We have had heat indexes of 110, 112, 113, and boy, we had a cold spell come through yesterday, though. The heat index was only 102. Amazing. Had to wear sweaters and jackets, whatever. Okay. We are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse. We've been focused on Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following for a good little while. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been sharing with you that the language of the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, what have you, coupled with the language of what is known and called decreation, is typical Hebraic apocalyptic language that was never intended to be taken literally. Now look, we have to make up our mind. Are we going to impose a Grecian, otherwise known as Occidental, not accidental, Occidental worldview onto the Hebraic scriptures? Or are we going to allow the Hebrew scriptures to speak to us in its vocabulary, in its vernacular, in its idioms, in its euphemisms, in its normal, everyday, ancient Hebraic context? And so I have to tell you, when I hear someone who, to speak very kindly here, who has never a day in their life studied Hebrew culture, has never studied ancient Hebrew history, has never studied and investigated ancient Hebraic thought, what some people call Middle Eastern thought. And these individuals, well-intentioned, no doubt, they jump up and they say, the Bible says what it means, and it says what it means, and it means what it says. And what they mean by that is they're going to interpret these ancient Hebraic scriptures through the prism of their modern, Grecian, Hellenized, Occidental worldview. And quite frankly, that's totally mistaken and misdirected. I have addressed this issue before. It is absolutely critical. Someone recently posted that on one of my YouTube videos in which I discussed the importance for understanding the Hebraic, or the nature of Hebraic apocalyptic prophetic language. And this individual said they had never read anything so corrupt in all of their lives. Well, that's interesting. I would suggest that individual has not done one bit of investigation, one bit of research, one bit of in-depth study of Hebraic thought. So what I've been doing with you and for you is to share the nature of this kind of language found in the Old Testament, keeping in mind that we find all of these New Testament prophecies of the coming of the Lord on the clouds of heaven, heaven and earth being destroyed, etc., and people take it for granted. I did growing up. That's the way I was taught. They take it for granted, that language is to be taken literally. So far, I've examined with you Isaiah chapter 13 and Isaiah chapter 24. And I want to examine today, and I doubt that I get through it all today. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible in my examination of this text, but look, it really needs to be examined at least a little bit in detail, and here's the reason why. because the New Testament quotes from it. Not to say that it had not yet been fulfilled, but simply to incorporate the language in the same way that Isaiah used the language. Now, I want to ask you to consider a hermeneutical question, a question of interpretation, the science of interpretation, which is hermeneutic. If and when a New Testament writer, or speaker for that matter, quotes from an Old Testament prophecy that is demonstrably, number one, fulfilled, and number two, therefore, in its fulfillment, it is demonstrably true that the language was never to be taken literally, and yet, point number three, the language that was used in this prophecy, which is demonstrably fulfilled and demonstrably not literal, that means that the language was to be taken figuratively, metaphorically, or to use the term, spiritually. So, once again, if a New Testament writer quotes from an Old Testament prophecy that we know is fulfilled, and yet that prophecy used language that sounds like the destruction of the world, then how should we understand the New Testament application of that identical language? The language that he's quoting from, the language that we can demonstrate has been fulfilled because the prophecy is fulfilled. I hope the question is clear. With that in mind, I want to call your attention to Isaiah chapter 34. And I've got to tell you, in my early struggles with my traditional eschatology, when I began to realize, and I fully realized, that the New Testament doctrine of the end times was nothing but the reiteration of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And so I began to go back into the Old Testament and to examine one prophecy after another to see how that language was being used. Now, mind you, I started out with the presupposition that when the Bible talks about, number one, when it talks about the day of the Lord, that's the end of the world. When it talks about the sun being dark and the moon not giving its light, the stars of heaven falling from the sky, I took it for granted. That's the end of the world. That's the end of time. That language has to be taken literally. But I kept encountering all of these time statements in the Old Testament that said, this day of the Lord was against Egypt. It was against Israel. It was against Tyre. It was against Sidon. It was against Babylon. It was against Assyria. And at different periods of time, those prophecies of the day of the Lord were said to be the day of the Lord is at hand. Now, pretty obviously, my view of the day of the Lord had not been fulfilled because time had not ended, earth had not been burned up. And yet in prophecy after prophecy, I found all of this language. The day of the Lord is at hand. The day of the Lord was near. And it's coming soon, coming quickly, coming shortly. And I discovered that when it said the day of the Lord against this nation was near, and that nation was going to fall in the day of the Lord, and I could find in the pages of history where that nation fell within a short time frame, all of a sudden it forced me to begin to rethink my concept of the nature of the day of the Lord. It's one of the reasons one of the very first books, actually it was my very first book that I ever wrote, entitled The Late Great Kingdom, a commentary on 2 Peter chapter 3. Because you see, I was raised believing that Peter was predicting the literal, physical, material destruction of heaven and earth. I mean, after all, it says the earth and the elements that are therein shall be burned up, and that's literal, right? Well, I thought so. But again, when I began to examine all of the Old Testament background and the Old Testament source, even for the prophecy of 2 Peter chapter 3, I discovered my hermeneutic was wrong. And that's the way it is with the prophecy that I want to introduce to you today. And here I am, basically out of time. So I'm simply going to introduce the prophecy. And I want to ask you, my viewers, to go there, and I want you to read the entirety of the prophecy. I'm not going to read the entire thing today. I'm only going to read down through, verse 6. And I'm going to stop there. I don't want you to stop there. I want you to read the whole chapter. Come near, you nations, to hear, and heed, you people. Let the earth hear, and all that is in it, the world and all things that come forth from it. For the indignation of the Lord is against all nations, and his fury against their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to the slaughter. Their slain shall be thrown out. Their stench will rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All their host shall fall down, as the leaf falls from the vine, and as the fruit falling from a fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down. And I'm going to stop right there. If I have a Western Grecian worldview of literature, language, then I'm going to read that text and I'm going to say, well, this is really obviously the material, the destruction of material cosmos, because the constellations of heaven are going to be dissolved. The earth will be completely destroyed. But do you know what? We have absolute proof positive. This prophecy was never intended to be taken, quote, literally, of the destruction of literal, physical heaven and earth. Well, I'm out of time for today. I mentioned my first book, The Late Great Kingdom. I expanded and revised that book a couple of times now. It is now called The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and order the book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. Send me a note that says you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll pay your shipping. I'll refund your shipping. That'll save you $5. Okay? Now, tomorrow we're going to dig into Isaiah chapter 34. You don't want to miss it, so I'll see you on the flip side.